So it really is a lovely thing to get to come out here and worship with you. It's a pleasure to be a part of something that is lifting people up, that is hopefully giving some kind of a path forward, whether we all agree on that path forward or not, that there are institutions, there are people, there are churches, there are groups that are really searching and really trying to find what is a good way forward. And today, that's such an important thing, to have people that are really searching earnestly and not just grabbing the answers that are so available to us. I want to begin by thinking a little bit about what I used to do, which was I was a truck driver. When I first got out of college, I was planning on being a history teacher, and then I moved down to Georgia, and I wasn't certified to teach, and I was done with school, so I went, truck driving sounds fun. And so I jumped in a big rig, and I learned how to drive, and I started driving around the country. And this was before we had these wonderful devices. Not before, we had them, but they were primitive GPS devices. So when I was driving around, it's not like I put in my destination and just blindly, went where I was going. It was a very different job back then than perhaps it would be for me today. Because I know that when I get in the car today, even if I know where I'm going, I put my GPS in, and sometimes it'll be like, there's traffic on that route, right? And then you get these traffic reports and go, I'm going to go the other way. And it gives us alternative directions. Back then, though, my job, half of it was studying my maps. At night, I mostly would sit there in the back and go, okay, where am I going tomorrow? And I would look at my map, and I'd try to remember all of the main intersections that I would pass, about how far away they would be from each other. If I missed my exit, what's the one that I would see that would go, oh, you missed it, you got to turn around. And it's important. It was really important to study my maps, and it made a huge difference on my day, because when you're driving down the road, you need to know where you're going in a big rig. You really do. It's a big, heavy machine that's very dangerous if you don't drive it well. So that was a lot of what I did, and I still got lost, of course, even studying my maps. I know. You would think that somebody like me could hold all of the whole map of the U.S. in my brain and just... Some people seem to. My dad seemed to have that ability. And so I had my backup plan. So I had my maps, and then there were times where I'd get lost. And my maps weren't very helpful at that point, because sometimes it was just not correct. And so I'd call my dad, and amazingly, I could be like, okay, I'm in North Carolina. There's this thing across the street there, and I passed this thing. He's like, oh, if you go another 2 miles up, you'll see a Conoco up on the right. He literally would have a visual memory of almost everywhere he had been, because he was a truck driver for 20 years. So he drove around this country, and that became so integrated into what he did and how he was that I could just rely on that. And what that meant is I didn't have to study as hard as he did I? Because I could always have that backup and call him. And, there was a time, though, where I got advice from my dad. I was driving down from Maryland down to Georgia, and I didn't think I had the time on my legal limit of driving. So I was like, how am I going to get here in that amount of time? And my dad said, oh, you would just split your sleeper berth. And it's something you can do a long time ago, but the law changed. So I'm driving along doing this thing called a split sleeper berth, which means I'm allowed to sleep 4 hours here, drive for a while, then sleep 4 hours here, and say, I slept for 8 hours. That's no longer legal. I didn't know that. They changed the law. So anyways, I'm driving along, and I get pulled over, and the cop says, you're not supposed to be on the road right now. And he gave me a big, massive ticket. And I called my dad and I said, you were wrong. It was terrible. My dad failed me. So it made me start doubting some of those instructions, and that's not a bad thing. My dad's a very smart man, and I rely on him for a lot of things, but things do change, and we do have to take ownership of the things that we're doing. So that means I have to be responsible for knowing where I'm going, and not just rely on my dad. There was one time where I was riding along in my truck, and I was going up. I had an old road atlas, And I went, I can cut 40 miles off if I go up this road through North Carolina up into South Carolina. And the road gets super windy to the point where my truck no longer fits. And then my engine doesn't want to get up the hill anymore, and it stops. And so I am stuck at the top, halfway up the top of a mountain with a truck. And somebody comes, a police officer, luckily used to be a truck driver, and he helps me out of the circumstance, and he says, "You're not supposed to be on this road." Well, what are you talking about? My atlas took me here. Nope, your atlas is wrong. This is a restricted road. How do I keep up with all of this information? When we're growing spiritually, when we're trying to learn how to be good people and on our path to heaven, this path of life, I think, is a little synonymous with that path towards heaven. When we're trying, there are going to be some things that we learn along the way that are useful for a time. There are going to be some methods of life that are going to be useful for a time, and then they're going to have to be set aside for more involved ways, more invested, better ways of living. I'm using GPS as an example here. GPS is great, and it gets me where I'm going, but I would stop studying my maps. If I were a truck driver today, I don't think I would study my maps. I don't think I would, because the answers are just there. How much confusion in life can we fall into when we just think, I have the answers right here? Just Google it. And what if those answers are getting more and more confusing? Because, man, there's a lot of people saying this is true and that's true, and those two things don't seem like they can be true at the same time sometimes. Our world is getting more and more confusing. The amount of information that is always present. Sometimes I think we get into this place of, I need to know what's the right answer so I can fit into this group of people in the right way, instead of really going, what's the true answer? And that's a big difference. There are a lot of ideas that are going to be important for us to get and understand and live by right now, perhaps, that might need to be left behind later on. There are coping mechanisms. For instance, if you ever have dealt with any trauma in your life or loss, there are certain coping mechanisms that we develop to deal with that loss, to cope with what's going on. And sometimes those coping mechanisms develop personality traits that we have a hard time letting go of. And they become harmful to us. I don't want to try to get too into the details of this, but we develop over our lifetime, and then we get into comfort zones where we go, I can live like this for a while. And it's comfortable until it's not. Until those answers aren't satisfying enough. There's two men, the disciples of the Lord, were walking on the road to Emmaus right after the Lord was crucified, and they're going, we thought he was going to redeem Israel. They had been listening to Jesus himself speak for a very long time at this point. Following him, he directly told them so much about this. He says, I'm going to be delivered into the hands of terrible people. They're going to condemn me. They're going to crucify me. But don't worry, because I'm going to rise again after 3 days. And so they're going, what does that mean? They're so confused because what he is explaining is outside of their ability to comprehend it. They haven't advanced to that place where they can really get what the Lord is meaning there. Why do you need to go away? That's what Jesus said. I have to go away. And he says, it's to your benefit that I leave. Why would it be to our benefit that the Lord leaves us alone? And then he says, but don't worry, when I get to where I'm going, I'm going to come back and I'll bring you to myself. And where I'm going, you know the way. And in that story, the disciples are going, what are you talking about? We're lost, and you're saying you're going to disappear, and somehow we're going to know the way? What a confusing story this would have been for them. And then especially after he physically dies, what must they have thought? We must have been wrong all this time. We thought this guy was going to redeem Israel. But what does that mean? What did that mean? And so Jesus was it seems a little, his reaction was like, oh, you foolish ones and slow to believe. That's not a mean, condescending thing, I don't think. I think from the Lord, it's just like, you've been trying, and bless your heart. Here's another way to look at it. Can we elevate our thinking to see something differently? And let's go back to what we were talking about in the plane. That little child that was bothering me, and it was bothersome. It's hard to hear a baby cry constantly. When I was thinking of it from my own things, I thought I was going to have a nice peaceful trip, get a couple of hours of sleep, work on my sermon for a little while. That destroyed my plans. It changes, my thoughts change, though, when I get out of how is this affecting me and my preconceived ideas of what I wanted and what I expected, and can go, there's something bigger. I might not get it right now. I might not understand it, but let me start looking. Let me start looking for that something bigger. And I think that the Lord, his little key for us to pay attention to is this switch from thinking about things from self to thinking about things from the perspective of love for our neighbor, from charity. And so that's where we get into this distinction that we read in the Heavenly Doctrines from Arcana Celestia 5:19, that there's a difference symbolically in the Lord's Word when it talks about walking with God versus walking with Jehovah. And you can see in the story of the road to Emmaus, when Jesus is walking, we mean that's the Lord by name. So this is physically two men walking with the Lord. It doesn't mean they have all the right answers. It means that they do have love for the Lord and for others. They're still stuck in their confusion because they don't have the right answers yet, but that love is what is driving them and what's obsessing them with this conversation. And so when the Lord does join them, they don't quite recognize him because they're not focused on it. But the Lord is with them and they can start hearing because there's a love for what is this really about? We thought he was here to redeem Israel. That was a very natural level thing. They were thinking of that as kingdoms of this world. The disciples, I think, do come to understand a little bit more, especially as they're going out as apostles and preaching the kingdom of God. That my train of thought just slipped away from me. Sometimes that just happens. Anybody have that? Just out the one side, and it goes. I think I'll have to jump to a different thing. Sometimes that just happens. I don't know why. Might be out of practice. Walking with God versus walking with the Lord. The disciples who are walking with the Lord there, they have that love in them. And so when the Lord is revealing that there's something bigger, it's not just about this earthly kingdom. You might think of what he says to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If it was, I would fight, and my people would fight. He's trying to elevate their thinking. What is this about? If he goes away, he will come and return and draw us to himself so that where he is, then we may be also. Did you notice at the end of that story that the disciples stop to rest, and it says, and Jesus would have gone farther. He would have gone farther. He indicated that he would have kept going, meaning the disciples weren't ready for what's maybe a little bit farther down the road. They're not quite ready to accept what the Lord really has to offer yet, but they're getting pushed along. So the Lord stays with them that night and breaks bread with them. Do we need to be perfect to hang out with the Lord and break bread with him? This story is saying no. He's going to be there at every step of the way. And as far as we're willing to take that journey with him from a state of just being concerned about how does this affect me to how does this affect others, is that a transition he can make us have in our minds, in our hearts? He's going to try to push us a little bit. Can you take that action and think about it from another perspective? Is that as far as you're willing to go? Can you go a little farther? No? Okay, we're going to rest here for a while. Walking with God, we were told, has to do with walking according to the dictates of faith, according to truths. The paths kind of represent these truths. And in some ways, we can think of this as we need to learn the truths in order to make ourselves live by them in a kind of forceful way. We call it self-compelling. Compelling ourselves to do what we believe is right because the Lord said so. And that's a level of thinking about the Lord and his word and our path of life. Those truths, the truths that are in his word, do lead us to heaven. This is the path of life. But if we're only doing it as a mechanistic thing, like a legalistic thing, okay, I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm going to follow these commandments exactly what they are. If it's just about that, I don't want to get in trouble, this is going to get me to heaven. There's something lacking in that mentality, isn't there? It's a necessary part to learn, just like I need to learn the roads. If I'm going to be a truck driver, I should study my atlas, learn my roads, get an understanding of them so I'm not getting lost all the time. But there's a time where it's much better to be able to understand where you're going and just drive. And that happens when we start thinking of things from a perspective of love for others. That's the transition that the Lord really is pushing us to make. And this only happens when the Lord isn't with us. Yes, the Lord is always with us, but it doesn't appear to be so. Sometimes it seems like the Lord is very absent. Sometimes he feels very distant from us. Sometimes we feel like he's not even there. In those times, it's important for us to remember that the Lord tells us he's still with us. We can even force ourselves to believe that. Okay, I don't feel it, but he told me. It's still in that walking with God phase. But a transition happens. Can we start trusting? The Lord is with me, so if I, of myself, choose to do what's good because it's loving, not because it's what I'm told to do, not because I don't want to get in trouble, but because it's loving, that somehow changes what we see. It changes the paths that are in front of us. One way to think about this is to think about it in terms of a marriage relationship. A marriage can appear rather healthy if both partners are completely faithful to each other. They don't go outside of the bonds of their marriage. They live by what their vows say. But if a person in that marriage is just doing it because, well, I don't want my wife to find out that I cheated on her, is that a good reason to not go sleep around? It still keeps you faithful in certain ways, but there's a depth that's lacking. And would that wife feel loved if that's the reason why? And does the wife always have to be there to say, you shouldn't be thinking that way or doing that? Or if the husbands or whoever's off on their own, they should be able to, of their own self, go, I love my spouse. I would never want to do anything to harm that or jeopardize it. Why would I ever think of going outside of those marriage bonds? It's a different feeling, isn't it? And it expresses a completely different kind of love. And yet, on the surface, it can look identical. To anybody on the outside, nobody's cheating here. It's a faithful, good marriage, right? Inside, it looks very different. Because the bond is made up of rules as opposed to by love. Now, yes, those rules help us to define what love looks like, but we can live by those rules and not have love. And that's not the path of life. In the Heavenly Doctrines for the New Church, or the writings, there's a wonderful, interesting story that talks about Swedenborg was in the other world, and he said he saw a road, a wide road, and it's everybody that was coming into heaven or hell from this world was traveling along this road. Everybody. And it's a symbolic image of everybody, the path from here to the other life. And it says everybody was walking together. And you couldn't really tell the difference between whether it was a good person or a bad person. But then the road gets to a fork. And there's a big rock in this path. And it says that off to the one side you see a narrow path that few take. And then off to the right there's a wide path that most people took. And of course it says that wide path was the one that went to hell, and the narrow one was the one that went to heaven. I hope that doesn't mean that lots of people are going to hell and fewer to heaven. And that's just kind of hopefully saying, hey, there's a part of this that has to do with you wanting to be loving and caring and wanting to live by these commandments rather than just acting that way. What this passage goes on to say is that when people get to that rock, which is basically the litmus test of, are you doing this from love, or are you doing this just to not get in trouble, says that the people who end up in hell trip over that rock and hurt themselves and then run down the wide path. And the people who go to heaven see the rock, they avoid it, and they see the path. Most of the people who go to hell, it says, don't even see the path that's to the other side of the rock. Such an interesting little snippet. What it's trying to say is that our minds are going to think of life in certain ways. And we're going to have certain trajectories that we're going to put ourselves on, and there are times where we're going to just do that from, I have to. But isn't it better to do it from, I want to? Isn't it better to follow commandments because it's good? So I think I want to close by just bringing things back to this idea of the Lord will show us the path of life. And in this psalm that we read, it's important to recognize that it's a continual process. As we are walking, this path is revealed to us. That over time, our own lives change, the circumstances change, and we need to keep going back to the Lord. And so that whole following the Lord on the path of life is challenging. I apologize. Some of this it's been a while since I've preached, so my brain is like not in this pathway of constantly doing this. I think I'm going to close with the words from Micah and contextualize it by thinking of there are times where we're just confused and we don't know the answers. And that's one way of reaching out to the Lord and one time frame to do that. And it's easier in those moments. But what about the times where we know we've made mistakes, where we've caused harm, where we've done the wrong thing. We know that we're the problem in the path, that the path we're on isn't necessarily the path of life. And sometimes that gets us really stuck in where we are, that we can't necessarily change those things, or we don't want to change those things. And we can feel pretty hard, or things can get pretty hard for us when we really feel depressed that we aren't on the right path. In Micah, there seems to be this question of when it is our fault, when it is something that we're blaming ourselves for, what do we come back to the Lord to get into his good graces again for? And this asks, am I supposed to come with sacrifices of 10,000 rams? Am I supposed to give my firstborn for my sin? And he says, no. And there's a reminder that getting back onto the path of life is rather simple. It's not getting stuck in what did I do, or why did I do it, and bad things there. It's just do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. It doesn't mean we have to fix everything in the past. From this moment, can we change our mindset to start thinking about what does it mean to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly in this moment? Humility, we're told, is the source of everything good and true that comes from the Lord. And it goes back to, if we think we have all of the answers already, why would we ever turn to the Lord? And yet, if we're given opportunities to recognize our shortcomings, that we don't have all of the answers, when we do make mistakes and see them for what they are, that we can go back to the Lord and go, hey, I want to get back on the path of life. And there won't be this horrible judgment of, no, you're not allowed back on, you messed up, you're done already. The advice is, we don't need lots of sacrifices. You don't have to give your firstborn for your sin. No, just do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. So what does that look like? Justice has to do with, our thinking. What do I believe is really good? What would be good judgment from the Lord right now? How could I apply his judgment to my life? And how do I then have mercy from that perspective? Mercy makes us start thinking about that other person. Loving mercy is recognizing another person might have made mistakes, but the Lord is always merciful. And that helps us when we have mercy on others, we can recognize that the Lord might have mercy on me too. So doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly. We can't have humility if we already have the right answer. And this is really the fundamental thing I want to get across this morning, is it's so easy to grab onto some idea and fight for it tooth and nail as if it's the most important idea. And we need to prove those points to each other, it seems, in society. And yet the Lord isn't asking for us to prove things to each other. He's asking us to walk humbly with him, to love mercy, which means, people are going to make mistakes. And yet we need to keep on going back to get better and better judgment. If we do those things, it's going to lead us on the path of life, and the Lord will continually show it to us as we walk with him. Amen.